Hello, Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome back to Transformations Cafe. It is the first program we're doing of the year 2026. This is Transformations Cafe, where we're serving light as bold as love. I'm your host, Ken Marks. This program is brought to you by the Institute for Global Transformation, or IFGT. We're a nonprofit all volunteer organization, and our vision is a world working together to utilize the power, love, and wisdom of higher consciousness to benefit humanity and the planet. Our mission is to support transformations in consciousness and in the way humanity interacts with one another so as to bring about positive change in the world individually and collectively. And we do encourage you to check out the website. There's scads of resources. There's a join button if you'd like to join our Change Makers community formally. And there's also a donate button, which we encourage you to also investigate. It takes you straight through to PayPal and supports our work, including programs like this one. This program is being recorded, and we're joined by a live audience, and a great number of you joined us tonight, and we're very humbled and grateful for that. Uh, if you would like to participate in the conversation, which you're encouraged to do so, we'll accept your participation coming on camera as your implied consent to be included in that YouTube recording. We're just delighted to continue what has become a beautiful tradition with us to have dedicating our first program of each new year with our guest, Georgia Lambert. Georgia is a just remarkable human being, someone that I have had the great privilege to know and be a student with for coming up on 4 years now. And it's certainly changed me and my life in many ways. And so we're so happy to have Georgia back. And this time we'll probably kind of follow the similar patterns that we have, but we'll take a look back a little bit at 2025, see if there are things that we can reflect back on that are associated with the wisdom teachings that Georgia can help maybe draw some connections to. And then we'll invite you, Georgia, to help us also explore that in these times of really profound change, I think that's an understatement, how we can, as individuals and also as a community of conscious change makers, respond with greater clarity and compassion and conscious choice and more fully integrate the ageless wisdom into our spiritual and human experience. So I'm going to read a short bio so that those of you who might not be familiar with Georgia have that introduction. And also highly encourage you, if you have not, to go to our YouTube channel and look up the previous conversations that we've had with Georgia, because as indicated by the term ageless wisdom, much of what Georgia has shared is timeless and is still highly, highly relevant. So with that, let's read a little bit about Georgia Lambert, and then we'll start our conversation. So, Georgia Lambert is an internationally acclaimed instructor who teaches numerous esoteric classes. She has over 50 years of experience in the field of esoteric studies, which in itself is magic for someone who's only 32. She received formal training in Eastern and Western disciplines, methods, and traditions. She was the first person to be licensed by the state of California to teach meditation and esoteric physiology, and she served for 10 years on the teaching staff of the Philosophical Research Society under Manly Palmer Hall. Specializing in the synthesis of the Western mystery tradition, she has addressed private groups in both the United States and in Britain. She's currently teaching in-depth classes to students around the world and has taught consistently for the last 40 years. Her classes cover a wide range of esoteric traditions and meditation techniques, including the Ageless Wisdom, the Kabbalah, Masonry, and the Arthurian Quest for the Grail. So we send you a warm welcome, Georgia Lambert. Welcome back to Transformations Cafe.
Hi, everybody.
You know what? I did look back at last year's conversation and just thought, if there is anything looking back that you can think about that took place in 2025 that you might have thought or be able to point uh, out to us as how these things that occurred were are referenced and known in the wisdom.
Well, I think the last conversation we had last year started out with, whatever shall we talk about?
It certainly did.
And so, ditto this year. We know that we're in the change of an age. We know that we're at the end of as the Hindus say, the Kali Yuga. And we know that humanity and the planet itself is poised for a new step forward. That, of course, means that those forces that oppose that next step are working overtime these days. 2025 was a major turning point spiritually for this planet. It's said that the conclave of spiritual masters, which meets every 100 years, met last year. We don't know exactly when during the year, but it's said that they met and decided on what to unfold in terms of the wisdom to humanity over the next 100 years. And that was dependent upon the levels of consciousness that humanity could reach. Well, in the autumn of last year, which is the embodiment cycle of the year, that's when all of the spiritual energies that come in during the big festivals in the spring kind of get grounded and anchored within humanity for good or ill, because it stirs up the negative stuff too, get grounded in the fall. And in group meditations, we got a sort of message that was similar to the message that Dwal Kul got with Alice Bailey back in 1942, and Dion Fortune also did in 1942. Now, remember, in 1942, the war was waging. It was at the height of the war. And yet, both Dion Fortune and Alice Bailey's group received communication that the war had already been won on the inner planes, and to proceed as if it were so. Well, this fall, we got a similar message. So the idea is that humanity is stepping forward, is taking its next step. It may take a couple years to work that out in physical dense, but the way forward is open for humanity. We just have to deal with the collateral damage of the opposition.
I'm almost thinking we should just be done.
Well,
That's a great way to start, Georgia. Thank you.
it would be wonderful if, the minute the consciousness changes, the form changes too. But there's always that lag time, isn't there, between when the consciousness moves into the new thing and when the persona can actually perform the new thing. There's always that lag time. So that's kind of what we have to deal with in working out what's unfolding today before our very eyes. Also last year, if I remember correctly, we talked about how we're in a time when cycles and patterns are repeating themselves. It's said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Well, we see echoes, don't we, from old Atlantean times, with this new age, the energy of the seventh ray is coming in. And the last time that was around was during the dreaded Atlantean fiasco. So we're seeing echoes of the old Atlantean period coming up. I'll give you one example. I think I gave you this last year, is weather used as war weapons. Regardless of all the glamour and fluff about the Atlantean episode, there are certain themes that keep coming to the surface, and one of them is using natural forces like weather in and as weapons of war. And of course, we're doing that today, along with genetic manipulation and that kind of thing. So we see all these old Atlantean overtones kind of bubbling to the surface. We also see overtones of the Civil War. There are certain patterns that are haven't been resolved there that are coming to the surface. We see patterns of World War II, a lot of those right now, and also the 60s. And so all these different timelines have kind of merged together, and we have on our plate in the world situation all of these patterns that were holdovers from earlier times that were mostly dealt with, but not completely. And so they're all up for transmutation and repurposing.
This is made me think again about something that you've shared in several classes, that even though there are these echoes and there are things that are coming back, we're on more of a upward spiral. And so even though we may hit certain parts of that 360 revolution and those things show up again, it's not just a direct repeat. It's at a
Right.
different level. And so that sounds like another opportunity for learning and growth and positive change.
Yeah, and we're told that, World War One, according to the Alice Bailey traditions, uh, World War One and World War Two were really two movements in the same war. And as it's been said by wonderful authors, Michael Bagent and Richard Lee, who did Holy Blood, Holy Grail, they also did a book called Messianic Legacy. And in that particular book, they were talking about, some of the occult stuff that went down in World War II. And they made a really important point. And they said that at the end of World War I, things were left vague. World War I was the war that nobody wanted and everybody wanted, and nobody won and everybody won. And it was left vague. And so unfinished business had to become more concrete in World War II. And they made the statement that in order to stand against evil, it has to take a form. Once evil takes a form, it can be stood against. And that was part of what was going on in World War II. Well, esoteric tradition teaches us that we're in the third phase of that war now. It's mostly a battle for ideas. It's a battle that's taking place primarily on the mental plane. Ideas of separateness and hatred, or ideas of unity and connectedness are at stake, as well as bridging that gap between higher abstract mind that is receptive to spirituality and lower concrete mind, which is thought forms that can be very selfish, but don't have to be, to bridge that gap. So here we are in the third phase of the World War. This battle is waging on the mental plane, a battle for ideas. But what do we know about the mental plane? The mental plane is the plane of cause for the three lower worlds. So what begins as a thought is going to land physically sooner or later. And that's what we're seeing on the world stage. That what begins as thought is going to take manifestation, and we're beginning to see the manifestation. This is the north and south within every human soul that is being worked out. And this is above politics. I don't deal with politics because both sides of our dual system are absolutely necessary. But what's going on now is above politics. And a thing to think about is, we read about history. We read about what went on in the Civil War, and we read about what went on in World War II, and we read about how Hitler moved into Poland and Austria, and no one lifted a finger. We read about how the brown shirts stopped citizens asking for their papers. We read about valiant, courageous Germans hiding Jews in the attic, and we read about the Japanese internment in this country. And maybe in high school, as you read about these things, you wondered, what would I do if I had lived in those times? Well, now we get to know.
Well, you've touched a very deep personal button with that one, which I won't belabor, but I have wondered most of my life until the last, say, 10 years or so, because my father's family had to flee Nazi Germany. And I wondered how in the world could something like that have been allowed to happen and come to power, never believing that only one generation later in that family it would be happening in the very nation that was the epitome of the antithesis to flee to and find something much more safe and free. So sadly, we now know how this can happen, but we do have a chance to change the course. But to Dina's question, just because we've kind of gotten a preview of the how the story may end, at least this chapter, doesn't mean that there isn't more of drama to come, it sounds like.
Right. And even, back in World War II in 1942 with DK and Dion Fortune telling their people that the war had already been won, it wasn't immediately finished in 1942. It took 3 more years for that to work out. But fortunately, we're living at a time where things can happen very quickly. There's that biblical phrase, the twinkling of an eye.
Hmm.
Things can happen and turn on a dime now. We're in this movable place where matter is in free fall, and it's really easy to get new directions in there. And this is the time when the world's spiritual community can really focus new ideas of unity and connectedness and humanity as a one life. Remember that the clear, focused thought of a spiritual thinker carries more weight in the force, in the etheric network, than the vague, fuzzy thought of the average individual. So it's not about numbers, it's about intent and clarity. And to proceed from this point as if the war has already been won and act on that is going to be extremely helpful. And again, as I just said, we're in this time when things can change on a dime. I'll give you an example. Think about as far back as you can go in history. Humanity had the horse. The horse pulled plows. The horse went to war. The horse was travel. The horse was interaction between groups of people all over the globe. The horse was it for thousands of years. In one generation, when the car was invented, our whole economy changed. In one generation, a pattern that was thousands of years old. So things can change pretty quickly, but remember, things start on the mental plane, and it starts with thought. And part of the difficulty within the world community is a lot of people internally are having this battle between what they know mentally and spiritually and what their emotional body believes. Because you can know that humanity is a one life, but maybe you have certain prejudices that you grew up with as a child that are part of your astral emotional self. And there's, some healing to be done and some integration to be done within one's own self. So in reference to Dina's question there, the Civil War is within each of us. And it starts with our own integration and then our own action based on that highest and best integration.
So it sounds like that message from last fall was perhaps more about, as you said, proceed as if the outcome is positive or the war is won, but not to be confused with the possibility that if that timelines could still shift or that free will could still intervene and change that, or is that not the case?
Well, we could say that humanity is at that place where it's not only taking a step forward, but there's a new kingdom being born within humanity, the kingdom of conscious souls. And that birth is underway, whether we like it or not, because we're part of the planet and the planet is stepping forward and taking its next place. So the baby's going to be born whether the mother's in the hospital or lying in a field somewhere. Our free will determine how difficult it's going to be, how much collateral damage there's going to be, but it will take place. We can prolong it, but we can't hold it off.
So I'm going to use this as the opening I was looking for, and talk a little bit about something that Georgia and I were discussing before we started recording. I had several independent references to at least so far, a 2-season podcast program that you can also find on YouTube called the Telepathy Tapes. It is stunning, and it is the most concrete proof that I've come into yet of what, Georgia, you were just talking about. It is a program, briefly, about nonverbal autistic people and the very rigorous empirical study proving that these individuals have not only telepathic capabilities, but they also have many other spiritual, or what they refer to in the program as psi capabilities, which could also be described in spiritual or metaphysical terms. And it's no longer just a gee whiz, what if, and with still room to poke holes in it. They emphasize the rigor with which the testing they've done is bulletproof when it comes to empirical methodology. And they put a lot of emphasis on the contrast to the scientism and the material science philosophy, if you will, that has dominated much of humanity for the last few hundred years at least. And this program is just irrefutable proof of us being more than just these human, physical, mental, emotional forms. And they also demonstrate collective consciousness at work. And I hope that's just intriguing enough for those with us tonight and who will watch this recording later to check out the telepathy tapes, because I think it feels like, talk about time speeding up. This seems like a huge catalyst for us to move toward that kingdom of conscious souls you talk about.
There's a couple different things that are going on as humanity takes this next step. We're also seeing the seeds of the next root race being born. And the thing about a new characteristic that comes into a species is that in the beginning, there's only a few members of that species that have the new traits. And they're seen as oddballs. They're seen as outsiders. They're seen as something being wrong with them.
Or heretical.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then everybody has that trait and it's considered normal. And then at the end of that cycle, the people that don't have that trait are seen as the oddballs and abnormal. And so spiritual tradition tells us that this next root race will be telepathic, and that we'll only use speech for ritual work and creative work. And this, of course, goes along with the idea of humanity being the creative center for the planet itself. So what we see as autistic are individuals that are coming in with highly sensitive nervous systems. Their nervous systems are so sensitive that being in the world is painful, and they have to retreat inwards, and interaction with other human beings is mostly painful. This is why they do so much better with animals, particularly with horses, for instance. And we'll see more and more of that as we go on into this next age. So these are what we're looking at here are not complete, but partial examples of forerunners of where humanity is going to go in the distant future.
Yeah, and I think what is also just very and another aspect of this, what this program illustrates that's compelling is it is not just these so-called autistic children and adults that are talked about in the program that have these capabilities, but it is their parents and teachers and therapists and others they interact with that they're able to communicate with, which then means that we all have those capabilities. They just haven't been expressed.
Right. Absolutely.
But it is, for me at least, so easy to see just in kind of a parallel to what you're saying that yes, okay, the war's already been won, and this is now a huge kind of sneak preview into what we are evolving to, and it's no longer science fiction.
Right.
Yeah, it's
And
really
another way that we can see this change in consciousness is that going back into humanity's dim, dark past, when humanity was just little more than animal man in terms of its expression. We see the consciousness only concerned with self, getting enough food for self, getting enough shelter for self. And self became family, getting enough food for family, getting enough shelter for family. And then it became tribe. Your tribe was important. And a lot of consciousness within humanity today is still tribal consciousness.
yeah.
But we moved on to national consciousness. And now we're at the brink of being international or global consciousness. And I've said this before, but there's a difference. International consciousness is taking the same patterns that we play with nations and just making them bigger. Global consciousness includes the other kingdoms in nature, right relationship with the animal, the plant, and the mineral kingdoms, as well as the spiritual kingdoms. And so this is being resisted by those forces that want to keep humanity asleep, want to keep the status quo in place, those forces that give matter predominance in that trinity of spirit and consciousness and matter.
But this is what has already been defeated.
On the inner planes, we got to now act on it outwardly.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that. We're seeing this, finally, we're seeing this separative impulse that's just running rampant, not just in this country, but in all over the globe. It's not just this country that's experiencing these echoes. It's everywhere, each in its own way, in its own nation, according to the nation's karma and so forth. But this is where we are. And even though we accept that shift on the inner planes, we have to proceed as if, which means we have to act on that mentally, with our feeling nature, with our actions, and with our words and our activities.
So would you agree that as we collectively reach these, what Marianne Miller and others in IFGT have talked about, this tipping point? So like when you were talking before about the first few seem like the oddballs, and then you get to a certain point and it becomes the norm. And so as you get through each of these kind of tipping points, so as more people get used to being kind of a part of a global community or consciousness, it would be that much easier to then understand being part of something even broader like galactic consciousness.
Absolutely. And this is preparing us, isn't it? I know some of you are probably, like myself, Star Trek fans. And if you remember, on the bridge of the original Star Trek, you had diversity. You had Vulcans and you had, people from all over this planet. You had Chekhov and you had, Michelle Sulu and,
Right.
and Uhura and they were all from Earth, not from Russia, not from America, They were all from Earth.
Hmm. Yeah. So yeah, Star Trek was a great preview of what we're evolving to. I agree. Um,
And let's hope that, part of what's thrown into this mix in the not too distant future, if not within this incarnation, certainly the next one to follow, the whole disclosure factor.
yeah.
And according to the resonance that humanity produces, we get to meet first either the Klingons or the Vulcans. Depends on what we attract by the frequency that we put out into the planet's aura.
All right. So everybody,
Is that woo woo enough for you?
yeah, that's good. But I just want to make sure everybody understands. Think Vulcan, act Vulcan.
Yeah.
Um, the other thing, well, another thing that I thought would be good to do, since that's kind of what we uh, said we intended to do with this conversation, is to see if there are elements of the Ageless Wisdom that might speak specifically about the year 2026. Is there anything that you can identify, kind of parallel to the conclave for 2025?
Well, that conclave that happened in 2025 is only once every 100 years.
Hmm.
But every springtime at the full moon of Taurus, which the Hindus call the Wesak and the Buddhists call the Wesak festival, the spiritual hierarchy draws closest to humanity. And so at the full moon of Taurus, we get the input of spiritual energy for the year. That spiritual energy then that comes in at the spring begins to percolate through higher mind into lower mind, concrete mind, into the emotions as we get into the fall, which is why things seem to really hit the fan in the fall, because now it's getting into the areas of the personality where most of humanity lives, which is the emotions. Um, and so we aren't going to have that 100-year conclave, but we do have the yearly conclave at the Wesak period. Now, astrology is not my forte, but everything that I've heard from people who do that successfully uh, state that the energies are dynamic here in 2026, and they're very conducive to leaps forward in consciousness expansion if we can take the moment.
And I'll use that as an opportunity to share with people in our audiences that may not be aware that two of the people in our audience tonight, CJ Mulcairn and Diane Collins, uh, share the joy and duty of writing a column each month in our newsletter with an astrological article. And they're working on creating an opportunity to share that across a new medium too. I don't want to steal their thunder, but that's something else that folks can find through IFGT. And what you've said, I believe they would both very much agree. And what I've read from them so far this year is, very much on point with what you just said, Georgia. I don't know if
And of course,
CJ or Diane want to comment at some point.
yeah, each individual month, around the time of the full moon, this is when the soul of humanity and its personality are closest together. So there's easiest transference of the higher wisdom into our brain awareness at that full moon time. That's the input time. The dark of the moon is the time when we have to anchor it, ground it, find it in some application in our lives. So if we can keep this rhythm, this monthly rhythm, that's also helpful because it ties into the rhythm of the world discipleship and its meditation work and cycles.
Yeah, well, good advice. And um, I've also wondered, there seems like there are also other themes that are consistent across different presentations. There's a gentleman, some of you may be familiar with, Lee Harris, who provides, he uh, gives both an annual and monthly energy updates, and his January update seemed to capture some themes that I've been hearing a lot about. And I'm wondering, Georgia, if the wisdom might speak to some of those things for 2026. One of them being like how many of us are experiencing, probably relating back to this idea of an internal civil war where we've kind of left one shore, but we haven't reached the new one. And so we're in this void and we're having to learn how to be in that space. Is there anything in the wisdom that speaks to that too and that might be highlighted for this year?
Sure, there's a whole lesson in the Nature of the Soul series that speaks to this very point, where there's this place on the path where you've left the old world and the way that things used to work for you, uh, especially if you're a very competent adult and good at something. But you move from there into this no man's land, and you're not really into the new yet. You haven't learned the laws that make the new physics function. And so you're kind of stuck in this place of impotency or limbo for a while. That's normal. That's normal. Don't worry about it if you're there. Just keep your eye on the star ahead and put one foot in front of the other.
Yes, and I think that, it's helpful to know that there's some normalcy to it. But it has also struck me as like give it all its due. There's a grieving that can happen with letting go of those things that maybe were familiar in form or in belief or values that no longer work. And it can also just be so disquieting to not know what to do when you're kind of between these spaces. And it's helpful in part to have wisdom shared that this is normal and don't be too upset, but to also just recognize that you're allowed to be upset.
Absolutely. And also this is part of, dare I say it, the aging process.
Yeah, well,
When we were young, we had our whole lives ahead of us and all kinds of stuff to do and family to raise and all of that kind of stuff and work to go to and livings to make. And as we get older, it's like a lot of that stuff just naturally begins to fall away. And there's sort of a grieving process like, oh, it used to be so fun to do this or that. And it's not like you've stopped it or put a lid on it. It's just that it's kind of fallen away. And this is an empowering process. The image that I use for this is the scabbard is falling away from the sword, and the sword finally gets to come out and be of service.
yeah, let's go into this a little bit more because I think there is kind of a theme emerging tonight about this proceed as if, and it is um, I think it's difficult to hang on to that understanding at times, but it can also be where communities like this one come into their service more to understand that these things that can be so upsetting to witness. And I've talked to several people I know who are as grounded and spiritually connected as anyone I've met, and even the things going on today have gotten to them at times. And
Sure.
yet, and I want to put this in form of a question: Are what are these things leading us to? It seems like the kind of that for form to change, the old has to be altered in some way, including destruction, before the new can emerge.
Absolutely. It's, the old phrase of, in order to be a butterfly, you have to give up being a caterpillar. And, you know, being a caterpillar was kind of fun. You got to eat all the time. So there's, that aspect of things. But, from our spiritual training, we know that things move from subtle to dense, and things have to begin with thought, move to the emotions where they're empowered, and then be brought into physicality. So it all starts there on the inner planes. And that's where the world discipleship can come into its own more than at any other time in history.
For those who might not be familiar, you want to tell us a little bit what that term means, world discipleship?
These would be the spiritual workers, regardless of lineage, regardless of language, regardless of techniques. There's no one organized group, but the network of light workers all around the planet. There are more light workers incarnated this time than at any other time in history. And part of what's going on within humanity en masse, but what's going on within the world discipleship is its coordination and beginning to work together more than at any other time in history. And of course, the internet has helped out with that quite a bit because we see worldwide meditations, at certain times, at certain festivals, more coordination than ever before, more receptivity at full moon times. Uh, all of this is going forward as well.
One of the things I find myself remarking on more and more is how it seems at every single level, layer, aspect of life, the these changes are happening and we're being kind of made to face the truth that has always been there, which nothing is certain. It just we formed collective beliefs that allowed us to live for quite a while as they were, and those of us who are enjoying the aging process or maturing can contrast that with several decades of the collective beliefs that were never really true, but we just always assumed they were. But it is at every level of life, I think, that these changes can be happening on in very specific aspects of one's individual life, and then they go through just really every level of collective life. Because I've said a few times to folks in conversation, never did I ever imagine that in the background of a bunch of changes in my own life, there would also be a time when I would legitimately be able to question whether people would like uphold the US Constitution and agree as a country that that was kind of the where the buck stopped. And yet here we are.
Yeah, exactly. And, science is another arm that's bringing us forward quietly under the table. The new realm of plasma physics is what science is coming up with in that shift from physical dense or the 3D world into the next level of matter, which is the etheric network that vitalizes and connects us all. And what's being learned today in the plasma studies and plasma physics is going to get us into that next level where we realize that we're not meat beings, we're plasma beings.
Mm.
And there's a whole nother level of connectedness that's part of understanding how we're connected. Can you imagine the shock of human consciousness if all of a sudden you woke up tomorrow morning and you could see lines of light connecting us all, and you could see the effects of your thoughts and emotions in the snowflake that you're the center of? It's a good thing that doesn't happen instantly, but we get to nose into it a little bit so we can clean up our behavior before we have to actually show ourselves, our real selves, to other people.
Yeah, and you reminded me of how so many times on my own path, I've at times felt an impatience, perhaps, and running out of time to evolve, and then realize that it has to go at the pace that's going, because if it happened any faster, my mind's been blown so many times, which is necessary, but there's a limit to how much voltage you want to get exposed to at once.
And one of my favorite sayings is the last prejudice to be overcome
Mm.
is the prejudice against prejudiced people.
Yeah. So guidance on that, Georgia, like how can we, are there ways other than just letting these things come to each of us as they will and at the pace they will, but are there ways that we can be intentional about increasing our compassion?
Well, to first of all, to forgive fellow human beings for being younger brothers, number one. To realize that the state of consciousness that we're dealing with is that state of consciousness. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to accept the behavior, but we have to understand where it's coming from. And all of this hate that's bubbling to the surface comes from a place of fear.
Mhm.
And that fear is the fear of change and the fear of moving into a world that's vastly different from the one that we've been operating in for thousands of years.
Yeah, and Russell has shared amen to that. They need the love most, although it can feel like they can be the hardest to love. And that's the getting over
And,
the prejudice
and
against the prejudice.
yeah, and there's this glamour that's out there in the spiritual community that, when you earn enough spiritual brownie points and you get to a place on the path, some magical thing's going to happen where you'll just love everybody. That's not going to happen. As long as we're living as souls in a persona, there are going to be persona differences. This is where the heart center becomes really important, because at the heart center, which is always moving outward in compassion toward humanity, that's the place where we have to will to love. Those people that are like us, that we agree with, easy to love. Those people that are different from us, that are handicapped by their filters and their prejudices, those are the ones we have to will to love. It doesn't come naturally, but we have to will to do it, recognizing that we are all brothers, even those brothers that serve what we would call the dark side, perhaps. They're still brothers, they're still part of humanity.
So is just Russell just commented, it's hard, but it's possible. I was them once. Thank God. All right, Russell. Well,
Remember that old
glad
cartoon
you've joined us.
remember that old cartoon strip Pogo, where it was during the Vietnam War, and Pogo, the little dinosaur guy, says, "We have met the enemy, and he is us."
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Um, Dana has another question. Esoterically speaking, is or has there been a necessity for sacrifice for humanity to make an elevated shift?
Yes, but that sacrifice, remember the word to sacrifice means to make sacred. Doesn't necessarily mean to die. Sometimes it does, but a lot of times it doesn't. But in order to move into the new thing, you have to sacrifice living in the old thing. And that means change.
And that's back to living in that void during that process too. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Is part of what we are evolving toward in this kingdom of conscious souls coming to have a greater I'm going to use the word understanding, but that often connotes kind of a more of the intellect and the lower mind, and I'm talking maybe more of that embodied knowing of how the the duality that we often struggle with of being feeling separate or individual and yet also having an awareness to varying degrees of being part of something collective or the oneness, um, is that disparity going to become easier for humanity to live with and it won't be so paradoxical?
Yeah, and that is a natural result of the opening of the heart chakra.
Yeah.
You know, one another way of looking at this change humanity is facing is it's said that humanity is trying to complete the first initiation, which is the opening of the heart. There's a difference between the aspirational solar plexus and the heart center. The heart center is always outflowing, it's always group oriented. For instance, when we look at our civilization and we look at how it's powered by the financial system, which is still very separative. And yet, when there's a natural disaster like an earthquake or a war where people are starving, humanity's heart center kicks in and people go down to the Red Cross and give blood and they get soup cans together and they fund Doctors Without Borders. And that's a natural outpouring of connectedness from the heart center. That has to become more and more the norm. And that will be part of this new age that we're moving into, where the finances of the world will be from the heart center rather than the separative position. Um, this is something that each of us comes to in our own way, in our own time, but collectively, it's a movement forward of the whole consciousness of humanity.
Yeah, it reminded me of things, and if these are things that are not appropriate for discussions outside of the courses you teach, then that's fine. But you've taught about the real uh, essence of the economies is not the money in the physical forms, but the circulation.
Right. It's all about health. Circulation and health go together. If you look at circulating water, it's all healthy and coming down in waterfalls and moving streams. When it gets sidetracked and stagnated, then disease occurs. Whenever there's stagnation, mentally, emotionally, or physically, there is disease. And health means restored circulation. And so the idea of money is the power of money, for instance, is not how much you have, but how much you can move with it.
Yeah, and moving toward that evolution. Um, what do you do, Georgia? I don't know if do you ever get hijacked and caught in things, or have you gotten to the point where you're able to stay in a place of observing and knowing?
Well, when I get into those places of sadness at observing what's going on in the world, and there are many. Some of you who have been my students know that my father and grandfather and family with my mother were all at Pearl Harbor the morning of going through all of that. And then my father was on MacArthur's staff all during World War II and later became one of the founders of NATO.
Yeah.
So that military lineage is strong in my family, and seeing a lot of what's going on in the world, there's points of sadness, there's points of frustration, but I just take a deep breath and send love to those parts of myself and say, it's working out. It's got to come out this way because even though humanity's ultimate destiny is fixed, the way we get there is our free will. And that's what's being exerted here on all kinds of different levels, and it's all playing out. There's also a weird thing, and I know this is going to sound totally woo-woo, but here goes anyway. In the 1960s, particularly with the Kennedy assassination, there was some kind of bilocation of time. There was this glitch in time that happened. And it's like there were two streams that were created, and now they're trying to come back together. And so there's the sense of two completely different realities on the same planet at the same time. And they're trying to merge back into one another and correct our coordinates so that we can move forward without that breach. And that's part of the strain and struggle that's happening right now. And how that's going to happen and when that's going to happen, your guess is as good as mine. But that's, adding more carrots to the stew here in planet Earth.
Yeah, and what you said a moment ago too is just another nice reminder of that when we talk about developing compassion, a good piece of that, if not the most important and initial piece, is to be more self-compassionate and to all those parts, the sad parts or the scared parts and the frustrated parts, and to allow all of us, all aspects of ourselves to be there and welcomed and not stuffed down or try to ignore or tell them to go away. Those are critical. One other thing I would share, I've had the opportunity to be re-educated in a model that kind of explains what makes us all tick, called the Enneagram. And I would just encourage those of you who are not familiar, we've talked with other guests on this program about it a bit, but it can be a great tool to help facilitate what Georgia was just talking about a bit, to learn yourself even more and more deeply, understand your own patterns, and with that understanding comes both growth and the compassion to facilitate that growth. So I thought I'd share that as well. Diane has a couple questions in the chat that I wanted to get to. So she says, when Georgia, you speak of the forces acting against the elevation of consciousness, what forces are you referring to, in the non-physical or physical?
In both, because what exists in non-physical on the inner realms finds its way into physical touchdown points. And so again, it begins on inner levels. And this would be those forces that have not been transmuted to light yet. Now, what do I mean by light? Light with a capital L means matter, whether it's physical matter, emotional matter, or mental matter, but matter that can carry the soul, matter that is the hands and feet of the soul, the Grail chalice of the soul. Not all matter on this planet has been uplifted yet. It's said in esoteric tradition that this is not yet a sacred planet. So there's a lot of forces that, instead of furthering the evolution of consciousness or soul, is furthering the evolution of matter, the form nature. And those forces that favor the form are the ones that don't want to change, that want to keep the status quo, and want humanity to stay the same. Remember, and I say this a lot in my classes, that the soul is immortal. It doesn't need the will to survive. The will to survive is a property of the form. And that will to survive is challenged at every change point. And so in these big change points that we're facing as a species and as a planet, that is triggering that will to survive of the form nature, and those forces that fight against it, consciously and unconsciously, on the inner planes and the outer planes, are bubbling to the surface. And that's what we're seeing in motion today.
Where does the knowing of the ageless wisdom come from?
Well, the Hindus have a name for it. They call it the rain cloud of knowable things. And at the change of each age, the spiritual hierarchy of the planet puts into this rain cloud of knowable things all of the wisdom to be unfolded in a 2,500 year period, the wisdom to be unfolded in an age. Ultimately, this wisdom will bring humanity to its spiritual adulthood or Christedness, but each age has its own steps toward that goal. And so the rain cloud of knowable things is now, because we're at the change of an age, a new rain cloud of knowable things. And this, again, is that wisdom that is held in solution at the highest levels of mind that needs to be invoked and pulled on by humanity and made into workable information.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One more, one more question quickly.
Sure.
What, how do you relate, or let's say you personally, and I know you said you don't know astrology, but the sense of the wisdom and the planets and the other celestial bodies as conscious beings. I mean,
Right.
that's how I relate to them. And I'm
Absolutely.
just
Absolutely.
wondering if you do and if that's a part of the ageless wisdom.
Absolutely. Yes.
Mhm.
There's nothing but life and sentiency everywhere. It's only degree. Humanity is individual, but each individual is part of the human family, which is part of the life of the planet, which is a being that's undergoing initiation, which is part of the solar system, which is a greater being, which is part of a galaxy, and so on and so forth.
Right. Because when you talk about, the ages, the 2,500 year ages, and they each have their own signature
Yeah,
energy, so to speak, right? Going into the age of Aquarius now.
right.
And that's part of the evolution.
And the
Um,
thing about this, the thing about the change in these particular signatures is the energy of the last stage that we're just moving out of was the energy of matter aspiring upward towards spirit. And we see this impulse in all of the world's religions and so on and so forth. It's matter aspiring to God, to the, overshadowing universals like truth and beauty and goodness. And we aspire to that. Humanity has successfully attained that connection. We haven't manifested it yet, but we've had that connection. And now we're in the age where all of that we've connected with must be brought down to earth and made real here. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So it's no longer the goal of the spiritual path to earn enough brownie points to get out of Dodge and, leave Earth and the three lower worlds and the wheel of rebirth and get to nirvana as quickly as possible. Now the idea is to bring the kingdom of God down here and make sacred even this place.
Beautifully said, and really matches what Marianne you wrote about the the IFGT logo. That's really what you're talking about, correct?
Right. Absolutely.
Hmm.
What is the single best thing anyone can do?
Be conscious of what you're putting out into the environment at every moment of the day. We are effective human beings, and our effect within the force field, the etheric network, is stronger than even we know. Your thoughts affect others around you. Your thoughts move out from you and become part of the stream of the circulation of humanity's mental network. Your feelings become part of humanity's feeling network, astral network. Your physical actions are expressive of anchoring certain spiritual principles in the world that serve either self or community. So the best thing that you can do is to be conscious of what you're producing outward into the environment. As a species, we've recognized that, our physical pollution affects us all. The crap we put in the air and the water is going to affect us all. We have yet to be that conscious when it comes to the emotional environment or the mental environment. So, spirituality begins at home, and we take responsibility for what we're adding to the network, because we're adding to it all the time, for good or ill. It's our choice.
Yeah, I think Georgia, that speaks to something I know that I've been experiencing this last year or so, and I've heard I have good company in this too. That um, as opposed to just reacting in fear and anger and frustration at some things, to be very deliberate to not add that energy.
And that doesn't mean
energy.
suppressing it. And
Correct.
that's the thing. If none of us are masters yet, none of us are adepts yet. So we're going to have those moments where we're less than noble in our feelings or our thoughts. But instead of saying, "Oh, cancel, cancel, white light," which doesn't really do anything, what you have to do is take that thought right at the moment you're thinking of it, and smile and send love to it, and then change it, reframe it, reform it right at that moment, and then send it out.
Well, I think we just did what we set out to do, which was share the wisdom, because that certainly was. That was beautiful. Thank you, Georgia. So don't see anything else from our audience. Thank you all for coming and being so engaged, Georgia. I'm so thrilled to have been able to enjoy this time with you today and these years as we study with you and maybe together. Hopefully, you learn something from your students too.
Oh,
And
always.
it's a joy, and it's also I feel each time we have these conversations, we start these last few years with such uh, I don't know, high energy that tends to veer toward anxiousness a lot. And at the end of these conversations, I know I certainly feel a renewed calm and hope, and we'll definitely be proceeding as if. So thank you for everything you've shared, and thank everyone for being with us. And we look forward to seeing everyone next month.
Love to all of you. Thank you so much for being out there, each and every one.